we have Dr. Perry Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks graduated with a PhD in philosophy from Purdue University in 2022. He's published extensively on philosophy of religion and the ethics of abortion. Most recently, he's finished a book on the doctrine of skeptical theism, which is forthcoming and to be published in 2023 by Palgrave Macmillan. Please welcome Dr. Perry Hendricks to the stage. Let me first introduce also Dr. P.Z. Myers. Dr. P.Z. Myers is an associate professor at the University of Minnesota Morris, focusing on evolutionary developmental biology. He's most well known for his incredibly popular science blog, Run, which he's been running since 2002. In 2010, Dr. Myers wrote a book on atheism called The Happy Atheist. Please welcome Dr. P.Z. Myers. Now, the debate shall begin with Dr. Hendricks' opening argument. All right, is this microphone?
Yes.
Am I good? All right. So, thanks everyone for coming out to this, and thanks to the Philosophy Club for bringing me out here. I had a really boring weekend planned if I wasn't here. I was actually going to make like a belt out of watches, but it turns out it would be a waste of time. So, the topic that we're going to be talking about today is whether God exists. I'm going to argue that God exists, and PZ is going to argue that God does not exist. What do we mean by God? Well, for our purposes, as Muthu was saying, we're going to mean a perfect being. And a perfect being is a being that's at least omnipotent, meaning it's all powerful, at least omniscient, meaning it's all knowing, and at least perfectly good. And why would a perfect being have these properties? Well, because if it lacked them, it wouldn't be perfect. It could be made better in some way. So theism is the view that God exists, and atheism is the view that God does not exist. Of course, we can't have certainty about whether God exists. It's always possible or wrong, just like any claim or theory. So what matters for our purposes is what's probable. We want to know whether the existence of God is probable given what we know. So how do we know whether the existence of God is probable? Well, the probability of a claim or a hypothesis is determined roughly by two factors. So we put together the prior probability of the claim with the evidence borne against the claim. What's the prior probability of a claim? Well, it's the probability of a claim prior to considering the relevant evidence. So take like a normal six-sided fair die. What's the prior probability the next roll will come up a 5? Well, it's going to be 1 in 6, or 6 options, and it's not biased in any way. So most of the fun stuff in this debate is about evidence. And so I'm going to focus most of my time on talking about evidence for theism, but I will have a little bit to say about the prior probability of theism later. So how can we tell whether I'm successful tonight? Well, if I'm successful tonight, I'll have shown minimally that the following claim is true, that probably God exists. And how can we tell whether PZ will be successful tonight? Well, if he's successful, he'll have shown that the following claim is true, probably God doesn't exist. And if neither of us are successful, we should be agnostic about whether God exists. The probability will be 50%, right? So here I want to say a little bit about the prior probability of theism. So in determining the prior probability of a hypothesis, there's a lot to say, but one really basic factor is the simplicity of the hypothesis is relevant. That'll help determine how probable it is. And so how simple is the theistic hypothesis? Well, it's pretty simple. It postulates a single entity, God, with a single property, perfection, of which at least 3 other properties are entailed by. And if that's all theism postulates, which is what we're talking about, well, it's pretty simple. And so absent other reasons unless we're given other reasons, we should think roughly that the prior probability of theism and atheism are roughly equal. Okay, so enough about prior probability. What's evidence? So when we're talking about evidence, whether God exists, we want to talk about whether our evidence supports theism or atheism. And what does it mean for us to have evidence that supports one hypothesis over another? Well, for this, I need to introduce a slightly complicated principle, which should be on your handout. It's called the likelihood principle. And it states this: a fact is evidence for hypothesis 1 over hypothesis 2 if the fact is more likely given the truth of hypothesis 1 than it is given the truth of hypothesis 2. This sounds a bit abstract, but I'll use some examples below to illustrate it. So a key upshot of this is that a fact is only going to be evidence for theism over atheism, or evidence for atheism over theism, if we can ascribe a probability to it. If we can't do that, it's not going to be evidence for either. Okay, so here's a few examples to help illustrate the likelihood principle. So first, consider evolution. How do we know evolution is true? How do we know about our evolutionary history? Well, one reason is that there are facts that are really likely if evolution is true and really unlikely if evolution is false. Like the fact that the age of the Earth is really old, or various facts about our fossil record are really likely if evolution is true, really likely if it's false, unlikely if it's false, and so we have good reason to think evolution is true. Here's another example which is on your handout. So suppose we had 2 bowls of Skittles containing 100 Skittles each. Bowl A has 90 yellow Skittles and 10 green Skittles, and bowl B has 99 yellow Skittles and 1 green Skittle. Suppose that somebody takes these 2 bowls and puts them behind a curtain and draws out a random Skittle. We don't know which bowl it's from, but they draw it out and they show us it. It's a green Skittle. This is really strong evidence that it came from bowl A and not bowl B. Why is that? Because there are 10 times more green Skittles in bowl A than there are bowl B. Or in other words, it's just way more likely to draw a green Skittle from bowl A than bowl B. That's why it's evidence for drawing it from bowl A. Okay, that's the bedrock of how to approach this issue. Hopefully this illustrated the likelihood principle decently enough. The basic idea, again, is that some fact is going to be evidence for hypothesis 1 over hypothesis 2 if it's more likely given the truth of hypothesis 1 over hypothesis 2. And this tells us how to approach this issue. For me to show that we have evidence for theism, I need to find some facts that are more likely given the truth of theism than given the truth of atheism. And for PZ to support atheism, he needs to find some facts that are more likely given atheism than given theism. Okay, so one final preliminary issue here is, how do we know what God would do? How can we predict how God would act? Well, there's a lot to say about this, but one way is to sort of think about what kind of world God would create if he existed, or what kind of world he would probably create if he existed. And so one method is to think about, what facts are in the best kinds of worlds that could be created. If we can identify the best kinds of facts that would occupy the best kinds of worlds, then we can make a prediction of how God will act. At least we can make some kind of prediction, right? This is because, if God exists, he's all-knowing, so he would know what the best kinds of worlds are. If he exists, he's all-powerful, so he'd be able to bring them out. And if he exists, he's perfectly good, so he'd be motivated to do so. A perfectly good being, after all, would create the best kind of world. I mean, if it created something less than that, then it's not going to be a perfect being. There's a lot more to say here, but I think this is a good enough groundwork to go to the evidence for theism. So below I'm going to talk about 4 facts that I'm going to argue are strong evidence for theism over atheism. So the first fact is a really cool fact about our world, and that's that there are conscious agents in our world. What are conscious agents? Conscious agents are things that are aware that they exist and deliberate on the basis of reasons. So for example, if I want to go to the airport, I have to think about how to go to the airport, what would be the best way to get there, and what would be the best time. I'm deliberating here. And there are a lot of conscious agents that exist. This room is full of them. Humans are conscious agents. But there are also arguably other conscious agents, probably like crows or octopi or orcas. So our world contains quite a lot of conscious agents. But more importantly, conscious agents are one of the best kinds of things that can be created. They're extremely valuable, right? And so think about it this way. If you had to choose between saving, a human or a bacteria, you should save the human. And why is that? Well, conscious agents are better than things that aren't conscious agents. Or suppose you had to choose between, saving a crow or saving a flower. You should save the crow because, again, conscious agents are better than things that aren't conscious agents. And this means that if God exists, he would know that conscious agents are one of the best kinds of things that can be created. So, and if he exists, he would be all-powerful, so he'd be able to bring about conscious agents. And if he exists, he's perfectly good, so he'd be motivated to do so. So if God exists, he has the knowledge, ability, and motivation to bring about conscious agents. And so if God exists, it's not at all unlikely that we have conscious agents. But what about if atheism is true? Should we expect there to be conscious agents if atheism is true? No. If our world didn't have to contain any life at all, there are many, many ways the world could have been that had no life. There also could have just been, plant life. Or there could have been just creatures that exist that probably aren't conscious agents, like garden snails or something like that. Evolution could have just produced, creatures that are not conscious agents. Maybe they're sentient or maybe they're not sentient, like plants. There's a lot of ways the world could be in which there aren't conscious agents, and there's no bias towards conscious agency in the same way that there is if theism is true. And so it looks like the probability of there being conscious agents given theism is greater than it given atheism, And by our likelihood principle, it's going to follow that conscious agency is evidence for theism over atheism. Okay, a second cool fact about our world is that in addition to knowing a lot of mundane things like this is a podium right here, or I have two hands, we have a lot of high-level knowledge. So we know things like the Earth is millions of years old, the universe is billions of years old. You know, we know about the probability calculus, we know about our evolutionary history, we know lots of cool high-level stuff. And creatures that have this kind of high-level knowledge are better than ones that don't. It's really good to have this kind of knowledge. Knowledge is good in itself. And if this is the case, you know, it's not at all surprising that if theism were true, we'd find there to be conscious agents with high-level knowledge. That's because if God exists, he would know that creatures with high-level knowledge are good. And if he exists, he'd be able to bring them about. And if he exists, he's going to be perfectly good, so he'll be motivated to do it. And so again, it's not unlikely that if theism is true, we have conscious agents with high-level knowledge. But what about if atheism is true? Should we expect there to be conscious agents with high-level knowledge? No. You can have lots of conscious agents that don't have high-level knowledge. Evolution didn't have to bring us to where we have creatures like us who have high-level knowledge. Chimps don't know about their evolutionary history. Crows don't know that the Earth is millions of years old. Orcas don't know that the universe is billions of years old. This is the stuff that we have to know. It doesn't seem likely at all that if evolution is true, it's going to produce this. It can go in many different directions. It doesn't have to bring us to have this kind of high-level knowledge. And if this is the case, then high-level knowledge is more likely given the truth of theism than given the truth of atheism. And by our likelihood principle, again, this means that we have more evidence for theism over atheism. Okay, a third cool fact that I want to talk about is moral knowledge. We have a good deal of moral knowledge in our world. What do I mean by that? I mean mind-independent moral truths. So think about this. It's wrong to set cats on fire, right? Can we all agree on that? It's bad to set cats on fire? And you know, even if everybody believed that you should set cats on fire, you know, they'd be wrong. You shouldn't do it. More generally, we know that things like slavery are wrong and that you shouldn't harm others for no good reason. We have a lot of this kind of moral knowledge. True, we have false moral beliefs, but we have a lot of true moral beliefs as well. And moral knowledge is essential for us to have moral agency. A moral agent is something that's responsible for the way she acts, right? So if you don't have moral knowledge, you aren't morally responsible for the way you act. My 1-year-old might accidentally scratch me and make me bleed, but I can't blame her morally because she doesn't have any moral knowledge. She has beliefs, you know, but she doesn't have any moral knowledge. She's clueless in that regard. Or think about like a shark. When it kills a human and eats the human, we don't morally blame it. It's not a moral agent. It's maybe appropriate to kill it, but we can't say, you did something wrong. The shark did something immoral. That's not right. So if God exists, it seems like it's not unlikely that we'd have creatures that are moral agents, because that would have this kind of moral knowledge, because moral knowledge is required for moral agency, which is a very good and important thing. It tells us how we ought to live our lives. And if that's the case, and if God exists, he would know this, that this is a good thing. And if he exists, he'd be able to bring it about. And if he exists, he would have the motive to bring it about, since he's perfectly good. And so if theism is true, it's not at all unlikely that we'd have moral knowledge. But what about if atheism is true? Well, it doesn't look like it's likely that we'd have moral knowledge given atheism. True, we might have moral beliefs, but that doesn't entail that we have moral knowledge. Evolution can guide us in lots of different ways. It doesn't have to align us with the moral facts of the matter. It could have had us thinking, just because it guides us to thinking that something is moral doesn't mean it's actually moral. It could have brought us all sorts of different ways. Or we could have just had no moral beliefs at all. Maybe chimps have no moral beliefs. I don't know, maybe they do. But they don't have to, is the point. And so there are a lot of different ways that the world could be without us having moral knowledge. And again, there's nothing biasing there's nothing biasing the world towards moral knowledge if atheism is true. And so again, we have more evidence for theism, because the probability of there being moral knowledge is greater given theism than given atheism. Again, this is like drawing, so moral knowledge is like the green skittle here. Theism is like pole A in the skittle example, and atheism is like pole B. When you draw the green skittle, which is moral knowledge, it's evidence it came from bowl A, so the theistic bowl, because there's way more skittles that are green in that bowl. Okay, so those are the first 3 facts. Here's a 4th fact. I can't remember, but the brief argument might be on the handout. But this 4th cool fact I want to talk about is going to involve a little bit of jargon. So the 4th fact is that there's a necessary foundation to contingent reality. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, contingent things are just things that don't have to exist. Like this phone is contingent. It didn't have to exist. It could have, the materials that were used to create it could have never been extracted from the ground. Or the people that created it could have just not created it. Maybe the factory got destroyed. Or take yourself. You're a contingent thing. You didn't have to exist. If your parents never met, you wouldn't exist. If your mom had an abortion, you wouldn't exist. There are lots of ways you didn't have to exist. There are lots of contingent things. If you look around, we're just surrounded by contingency, things that didn't have to exist. And so that gets us the first premise of this argument I'm going to use, which says that something contingent exists. We should all accept that. That just means there's something that exists that didn't have to exist. Okay, but there's another really cool thing we know, which is that all contingent things depend on things that are beyond themselves. Or in other words, anything that didn't have to exist is going to depend on something that's beyond itself. So think about this. You depend on something beyond yourself in the sense that you depend on your parents for your existence. You wouldn't exist if they never met. Or my phone depends on something beyond itself in that it depends on someone to have put it together. Everything that we know depends on other things outside of themselves, that are at least the contingent things that we know about. So we have good inductive support for this. But I mean, think if it were false. That would mean that you could run into a human who existed, who didn't depend on having a parent. Or you could run into a pile of snow that existed, that didn't depend on weather conditions or prior material. That'd be crazy, right? So I think we can see that this second premise, that all contingent things depend on things that are beyond themselves. But that gets us to a pretty wild conclusion, which is that there has to, at least one thing cannot fail to exist. Or in other words, something necessarily exists. Why is that? Well, take all the contingent things that we just talked about and put them in a big pile. And what is, by our second premise, which says all contingent things depend on something beyond themselves, we have this whole pile of contingent things. And it's going to have to depend on something beyond itself, right? But it can't be a contingent thing, because if it's dependent on a contingent thing, it's going to be in the pile itself. And that means that there has to be something that isn't contingent that exists. Or in other words, something necessarily exists. That's a pretty cool fact, right? Now, why is this evidence for theism over atheism? Well, because if theism is true, it's very likely that there would be this necessary foundation. It's very likely that there would be something that grounds all of contingent things. Or in other words, it's likely that there would be something that exists that grounds things that could fail to exist. But if atheism is true, that doesn't predict this at all. It doesn't make it likely that there would be this necessary foundation. It seems a little surprising, actually, if atheism is true, that we would find out that there's a necessary thing, a thing that couldn't fail to exist. That'd be pretty wild, right? And if that's the case, then we have more evidence for theism over atheism. Now here's something also which should be on your handout, which is that I've argued that there are 4 facts that are each individually evidence for theism. But when we conjoin them, they become even stronger evidence for theism over atheism. So by themselves, they're evidence, and then when you put them together, they're even stronger. Why is this? Well, think about it this way. If we're at the scene of a crime and you find my hair there, that's evidence that I committed a crime. But suppose you then find a fingerprint of mine. That's even stronger evidence than just finding the hair by itself. And then suppose that you find like my shoe. All 3 of those facts together are going to be more really stronger evidence for my committing the crime than any one of them individually. And so when we put these 4 facts together, we get really strong evidence for theism over atheism. Now, there's a lot more to say on this issue, but let me end with this. So as things stand, theism is more probable than atheism given the facts we've considered here. Perhaps PZ can cite some other evidence that swings the evidence in favor of atheism. But unless he does this, it's going to follow that probably God exists. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. Classes are over. Yes. And I hope you're all here just for an entertaining evening of discussion, because I want to tell you, there's not going to be an exam afterwards. What a relief. Okay, so as has been explained, and you probably already figured out, I'm the guy taking the con position on the question, does God exist? And I must admit that I'm not terribly enthused about making this the subject of a debate. I've wrestled with that particular question at least since I was 10 years old. And part of that process of wrestling was largely about trying to understand why so many other people believe in something so absurd. The only interesting part of the question is hearing how other people have come to their conclusion. So I'm quite pleased to see how Harry Hendricks came to his conclusion. That's an interesting datum. It's a fact that's now in my head. Now, Dr. Hendricks and I briefly discussed the boundaries of this discussion, and part of that was defining our terms, and we've already heard some of that definition. So my question when I was asked to do this debate was, what do you mean by God? God is, this is a major stumbling block. We're going to be debating the existence of something which is incredibly poorly defined. Now, I'm used to wrestling with thorny, complex subjects like try asking me to define homology or what is a gene. So I'm used to these very difficult questions that sometimes have ambiguous answers. But what happens here is that we wrestle with these questions and we try to pin down the topics, and we find that they're incredibly difficult. And I'm not afraid of that. I'm happy to talk about incredibly difficult things. The thing is, though, that the fact that a word is difficult to define does not mean that the referent does not exist. So I'll say that right up front. That the fact that we have this fuzzy, nebulous being that we're calling God is not necessarily evidence against it, but the definition is poor. So God is such a vague and poorly defined subject, lacking in concrete evidence, that it was actually relieved when Dr. Hendricks suggested a definition that he found agreeable, an omniscient, omnipotent, benevolent being. Great, I thought. We're going to discuss the silliest possible meaning of the word, so maybe we'll have some fun after all. In multiple debates on this subject, I've noticed that my opponents can't resist the temptation to defend the most grandiose, most extravagant, most extreme version of a God they can imagine. No petty little local storm god with some impressive tricks within him. Their God must be the mightiest God of them all, the God who can beat up your God. Guys, it's not a competition. Okay? We're not going to have a cage match here. And honestly, as an atheist, if you can show me any kind of God, I'll be impressed. So, show me the God of lost car keys, the God of curing hangnails, the God of mice, anything like that, and I'll be impressed. But no, it's always the God who knows everything and can do anything. They set the bar impossibly high, as if it's a contest in who can invent the most superlatives. And then, sorry to say this, but philosophers and theologians are the worst. Having invented supergod, the debate then consists of inventing post hoc rationalizations for why their supreme high overlord must exist. They don't actually show that the deity does exist. It's all about stacking abstract ideas into an elaborate logical house of cards that demonstrates why it shoulda, oughta, must exist. Every advocate for religion does this sort of thing, spinning out rationalizations for why their peculiar and specific version of God must of necessity exist, never noticing that all of the different advocates have different gods and they contradict each other. There's got to be one, right? If you're talking about the omnipotent Lord of the universe, there can only be one. But we got to deal with all these multiple gods all over the place. But I will say this for philosophers. At least they try to distill out a universal definition, expanding the meaning of God into a vacuous vapor that at least avoids obvious battles between Jesus and Muhammad or Odin and Mars. Instead, we're wrangling over some toothless, inhuman, intellectual abstraction. Now, I'm a scientist. Trying to rationalize a phenomenon into existence by arguing about it is not how we play the game. That means we may be talking past each other for an hour. It's okay, we can have fun with it. But here's how I would do it. I like empirical evidence. So you claim there exists a being who knows everything. Okay, let's start with small and simple. What's in my pocket? Okay? Ask your omniscient God to tell you what I've got in my right back pocket. If Harry doesn't have a main line to his God, any of you sing out and tell me what's in my pocket.
It's a lighter.
A ring.
Bonnie's.
You're guessing. You're just guessing. I can tell. I'm talking about actual knowledge, where you have a reason to say why that thing is there in my back pocket. You're all wrong, by the way. So, what I expect is when we get a volley of guesses, that we will cue the excuses. I know what people will say. They'll say, that's too petty for the omnipotent God of the universe. You're wasting his time. They will say, who am I to make demands of God? I'm a nobody compared to God. Another common one is, God is ineffable. We don't know why he won't tell us what's in my back pocket. Maybe he's got a good reason for it. We just don't know. A skeptical theist might say, well, we can't know the reasons God doesn't give the answer, so his failure on this test means nothing. Which is a nice dodge to get out of the whole problem. My favorite excuse, though, is when they accuse me of impiety or sacrilege. I've had that happen. It's quite fun. Because I've avoided getting burned at the stake. That's always nice. All I can say is that you're the one claiming that this God is the all-knowing Lord of time and space. He's got time. Yet he always fails the simplest of tests. And this is just a start. Okay, if God passed that test, if one of you actually told me what was in my back pocket here, ooh, I would be really interested in talking to you further about this. Because now we can start doing science. We can start doing tests and see what else your God knows. Maybe all he knows is the content of my back pocket, but nothing else that's of interest. But we could start asking questions and working our way through that. And again, because we're scientists, we wouldn't necessarily expect that every query would be reasonable or useful. It would just be nice if, for instance, when you ask God to do something, if he would say, no, I can't do that. But no, we don't get that. We don't even get that denial. It just doesn't happen. So we could, for instance, if God can see what's in my back pocket, we could say, okay, do a thorough scan of my body to identify any potential cancers. That would be useful. Let's ask him to do that for everyone. Early diagnosis is critical for effective treatment, as everyone knows. But we know already that this won't work. All through human history, prayers have been streaming skyward to ask for relief from disease. They are not the basis for reliable treatment. Notice also that I'm being very generous because I'm only asking for information. That would be easy to give. I just give you some information. I'm not asking him to snap his fingers and just make cancer disappear, which presumably an omnipotent being could do. I know, maybe God has his reasons. There's always an excuse. Maybe there's a reason why letting someone die of cancer is a benefit to humankind. Sure.
Okay. But then I have to ask, what is the point of postulating a hypothetical omniscient being if its knowledge is unknowable to us? If even the most trivial examples of knowing can't be known? If its omnipotence can do nothing for us? And then there's another huge problem with this whole God hypothesis. How do we know? How do we test it? There are a couple of very common canards about atheists that I'd like to lay to rest here. We do not hate God. Really, we don't. Sometimes I'll admit we do hate his believers. We can do pretty horrible things. We don't claim to have absolute positive proof that God does not exist. And Perry is quite right to mention this. If I had to answer the question of this debate in brief, I would just say, probably not. God probably doesn't exist, but I don't have absolute proof either way of that. The thing is, I don't know for sure, we don't know for sure, nobody knows for sure. We all have access to the same evidence, and it's the theists who claim that for absolutely sure there is a God. But the atheists are all saying merely, your evidence is unconvincing. That you're claiming certainty where there isn't any. And that you can't even define God in a clear, testable way. This is one of the reasons I don't care for these kinds of debates, because they are fundamentally about certainty versus doubt. And certainty is always preferred by the larger audience, while doubt is so inconclusive and so unsatisfying. This is a promise. I'm going to be inconclusive and unsatisfying tonight, because I can't know. And all I can say is that nobody in this room actually knows. If you prefer honesty and truth, though, the correct answer to the question, does God exist, is we don't know. I don't know. Dr. Hendricks doesn't know. No one here knows. In fact, if anyone here were to raise their hand and announce with absolute positive certainty that Jesus is Lord, or God is great, or gods don't exist, I'm afraid I would just roll my eyes and know that on this subject you aren't worth talking to. Dogmatism is so uninteresting. Slogans are not evidence. And finally, I must address this question as a professor of the liberal arts, as a scientist, and in particular as a developmental biologist. This one you might find a little bit of a peculiarity, but this is something I feel very deeply has to be a property of any deity worth worshiping. That is, one of the things I look for in a narrative or explanation is a beginning and a progression of events. I want a central character who grows and adapts and changes. This is true even for religious believers. The Bible starts with a creation story, explaining where people in the world came from. The Anishinaabe have a creation story. The Fulani people have a creation story. The Han Chinese have a creation story. If we go back to the Bible, it is full of stories, and stories are not static. They are full of events and change, beginnings and endings. Yet here we are discussing a deity that has no beginnings, is omnipotent and omniscient for all of eternity, who shows no progress, who is claimed to be benevolent but without any motivation, without any reason for his being benevolent. He just is. Just take it on faith. Richard Dawkins said that the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. But I would argue that the God we're debating here is the most boring character imaginable. A cosmic Mary Sue, a paragon of hyperbole. Why argue about his existence? Why worship such a being? It won't make any difference. It won't change its opinion of you, whether you're a mass murderer or a saint. It just is an inflexible and implacable entity that already has its mind made up, if it can be said to have a mind. Now, this is not an argument that such a being could not possibly exist, but only that it deserves no more reverence than the laws of thermodynamics, which are pretty darn amazing and marvelous and wonderful and enable us to be here. We don't worship them. They're just a fact of the universe. And although, we can measure entropy and see the effects of those laws, we don't worship Maxwell's equations. We don't have priests of the Church of Carnot wagging their fingers at us when we violate conservation of energy, because we can't, because it is a principle inherent in our universe. The omnipotent, omniscient God of Hendricks' proposition is indistinguishable from an intrinsic property of nature and cannot be interpreted as a being with a mind. And it can't be the kind of deity people promote in their churches. If you want to appreciate that kind of deity, skip church, skip this debate, and go take a science class or study the humanities. You will get closer to that God doing that than anything we can do here. Finally, the burden of proof rests with the person who wants to claim the existence of something. I'm pretty sure we're not going to see any demonstration of evidence in this auditorium tonight. I haven't seen any yet so far. We got a little more time left. Please do surprise me with some good, solid evidence.
That was something. I felt like I was at a sermon there. Wasn't much by way of argument or evidence given, but a lot of things said. So I appreciate things being said. Let's see. So this last point about the burden of proof. So PZ says, the burden of proof is on the one making the positive claim. Sure, that's true. But, and I mean, he wasn't responding to me, but I did provide, 4 lines of evidence for the truth of theism. So hopefully that puts that worry aside for now. I'm not quite sure I saw the point of all I'm not quite sure. PZ said something like, well, the God hypothesis is boring. I don't really understand what the point of that was. I mean, maybe it's true. Lots of things are boring. But I mean, it just sounded like a fun psychological fact about PZ, which is that he finds the hypothesis boring. I mean, I don't see that as terribly relevant to anything tonight. It's like PZ reading his diary. What did I think today? God is boring. Not much there. Let's see, what else? PZ says something like this, like, atheists are saying, they're not saying God doesn't exist for certain. They're just saying, we don't know, and nobody knows God exists. I mean, I agree that no one can know that God exists for certain because we don't know anything for certain. What matters is what's probable. That's what we have to go with, is what's probable given our evidence. That's why I argued earlier, given our evidence, the existence of God is probable. I never said it was certain because, again, we lack certainty. So PZ portrays atheists as saying, oh, we just don't know for sure, and theists say, no, we know for sure, we're 100% sure. Well, that's obviously false, right? Because, again, theists aren't saying that. Maybe some do, just as some atheists will say, we know for certain God doesn't exist, but so what? Lots of people say weird things. Let's see, he says, but the other claim he makes is, we can't know. Well, how should we interpret PZ here? Maybe what he's saying is something like this. Nobody knows that it's more probable than not that God exists. Sure, and maybe you can say that, but there's a difference between saying and showing. If you say nobody knows that the existence of God is probable, you also should show it. You got to justify your beliefs. You can't just say things. And what I've tried to do is show that the existence of God is probable. Now maybe PZ disagrees, but just simply saying the existence of God is not probable isn't going to cut it. We need some reason if to say it's not probable, you need to show that our evidence doesn't favor it. And well, as PZ said, the person making a positive claim has the burden of proof. So if you're making a positive claim that the existence of God, nobody knows that the existence of God is probable, you gotta, pay up, show that it's actually true. let's see. Now, what else did I want to talk about? Oh, PZ said philosophers are the worst. I mean, it's true. Philosophers are the worst, so he's definitely right about that. No qualms with that. And then, what else did I want to talk about here? I mean, PZ says certain things like we can't predict whether God, we can't tell whether God exists. We don't have any evidence for his existence. And we certainly, it sounds like he's just saying that there are no facts that favor theism over atheism. But again, this is something that needs to be shown. It can't just be said. Or if you do say it and don't show it, it's just not justified, right? Unless PZ wants to reject the probability calculus and say that we just can't know that certain facts are more likely or whatever, then he needs to do a little more work here. Was there anything else? I think actually that's probably, well, let me say another word. So when we approach this, I find PZ's approach a little bit puzzling. As I said, he was a little bit low on argument. There wasn't a lot of evidence given, not a lot of discussion of evidence either. So I think the approach that I was taking is the right one to take here. We want to look and see if there's evidence and see if that renders the existence of God probable. But it's not clear to me that that's what PZ is doing. He didn't offer any facts that are supposed to be more likely given atheism than given theism. And so he hasn't even offered evidence for atheism over theism. He also hasn't considered any facts that someone might claim are evidence for theism over atheism. And so it looks like this conclusion of PZ's is just unjustified. We've been given no reason to accept it, and no evidence has been given in favor of it, and he hasn't even tried to give evidence in favor of it. So, I guess I'll end with that.
Oh gosh, now I got to come up with evidence. Except I have to argue that Perry didn't give us any evidence either. That what he called facts were not facts. That, for instance, he said, he's arguing that conscious agency is evidence for theism over atheism. The world is not conscious. Most of the organisms on this planet are not conscious. We've got a few examples, primarily in the animal kingdom, where they exhibit consciousness. How is that evidence for theism? Because we've got perfectly good explanations that do not rely on supernatural sources of information that are derived from basic scientific principles. So we don't need to invoke a deity to explain this stuff. And nothing that he said is actually evidence for atheism. It's just, oh yeah, some organisms on this planet think. Okay, why do you need to say that implies that God must have done it? And I'm saying that, here's a biologist, I'm going to tell you, no, don't need a God, we got evolution, that's sufficient. It explains how it gets here. So that means that piece of evidence is not particularly useful. Then he argues, okay, high-level knowledge is evidence for theism over atheism. And I have to disagree again, that it's perfectly reasonable for high-level knowledge to arise by secular processes without any kind of deity intervening. It's the way we work here. I suspect you don't usually get the professors in your chemistry class telling you at this point a miracle had to have occurred, and God is leading this reaction along in a particular direction. We really don't need that at all. Now, he also makes some arguments that atheism doesn't predict high-level knowledge. Well, that's true, because this high-level knowledge, intelligence, things like this, are, as he later discussed, contingent properties of the world. That there are many things that could be the result of natural processes without a deity. And it's not sufficient just to say that some of them must have been created by a God. Because, for instance, with conscious agency, we've got conscious agents all over the place that arose by natural processes. So why do we need this hypothesis that God did it? Atheism predicts diversity. It predicts lots of possible solutions to problems in the world. Different organisms take different strategies. That bacteria are the dominant form of life on the planet doesn't seem to fit into his probabilistic calculations. Then we get this argument about morality. Yeah, we don't need a God to define morality. I mean, we just look around the world. We look at the most religious places on the planet. Look at the Middle East. Has God imposed any kind of moral solution there? I would say that religion actually tends to make people more immoral. It tells them that you've got a justification for whatever you want. All you gotta do is consult this holy book, consult principles, and say, oh yeah, that's what this means. And it just falls apart pretty quickly right there. If you ask an atheist, do you have an explanation for morality in the world? We'll have no problem saying how. That morality, empathy, cooperation have been essential in the success of the human species on this planet. That if we did not have those properties, we wouldn't be here arguing about it. You know, it's pretty clear that, lots of organisms fail to evolve morality, and they're not sitting around writing books or going to debates and standing around talking to each other about it. Now, the fourth fact he gave was this idea that contingency, that the existence of non-contingent phenomena is evidence for theism over atheism. Why think there's something that is necessary? This was a surprisingly silly argument. Okay, so he's saying that there are contingent things, and I agree that phones are a good example. Those are contingent technological properties that required somebody to create them. But then he goes on to say all contingent things depend on something beyond themselves. He gives the example of his parents giving rise to him. But biologists would tell you that all of these contingent things arose from lesser forms, very crudely, from more primitive forms, that we didn't require a God to create life on Earth, that what made life on Earth was vast clouds of hydrogen gas condensing into stars and planets. Are we going to call those God? I don't think that's, I think that's kind of putting our definition of God well beyond what I would accept. That hydrogen gas is not omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent. It is there. Same for any other property you want to say that created this complexity, this life on Earth. Contingency in itself does not imply a God. It implies something came before, but that something can be something pretty simple and crude that is refined by time to produce more complex things like us and cell phones. So his four arguments just kind of fall apart. They're not evidence. They're not facts. They are rationalizations of facts, biased to favor the theistic point of view. Okay, let's go on.
All right. Let me start with the last point first. Peasy agrees that there are contingent things. That's good. He goes on to say, that they do depend on things beyond themselves, but maybe this is just hydrogen gas or something like that. Well, unless he's saying hydrogen gas is necessary, that's not going to work. But we need hydrogen gas is presumably going to be among the pile of contingency, and we need to find by our second premise that all contingent things depend on something beyond themselves. It would have to be something that's not that. And the claim isn't we know what this necessary thing is. We would just say, we know that something necessary exists, and that fact itself is going to be more likely given theism than atheism. Okay, so PZ talks about the first three things. Well, let me separate out the second to last thing he talks about, which is morality. He says, something like, we don't need God for morality. Sure. He says, we can explain it. Some religious groups are deeply immoral or something like that. Sure. But that wasn't my argument. It wasn't that we need God to explain morality. What I claimed was that moral knowledge is more likely given theism than given atheism. That doesn't tell us that we need a theistic explanation, but it does tell us that this fact is more likely given theism than atheism. So just clearing up that a little. Next, he talks about the argument from conscious agency and the argument from high-level knowledge. At first, when he said that the facts I cited weren't facts, I was a little worried he was going to say that there aren't conscious agents. And that'd be kind of a bummer, because there definitely are. But he claims something like this. He says, we don't need theism to explain conscious agents. We have perfectly good evolutionary explanations. Sure. Nothing I said ruled that out, right? I said it's more probable given theism than atheism. So unless PZ is rejecting the likelihood principle, it's hard to see what's going on here. But, it also seems like PZ might be a good person to play poker against. So suppose that PZ and I are playing poker, and I'm dealt, 10 royal flushes in a row. Someone watching this might say, hey, look, it looks like Perry's cheating. He's a bit sketchy, and he got 10 royal flushes in a row. But, PZ would say, whoa, 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 that's a little too quick. We don't need to appeal to him cheating to explain this. After all, it's possible that he just so happened to get 10 royal flushes in a row. That'd be a bit odd, right? And so when PZ says, we do have possible explanations of these things, that's true, but we're interested in what's probable. Now in the poker case, what is more probable is that I was cheating, and that's why I got the 10 royal flushes in a row. But in the case of high-level knowledge and of conscious agency, it is possible that evolution produces those. We exist as a product of evolution, right? And we are those things. But the question is, what's more likely? What's it more likely given, theism or atheism? We've been given no reason to think it's not likely given theism, and we've been given no reason to think it's likely given atheism. And so it looks like the central premise, PZ hasn't actually contested it. He hasn't said that the probability isn't as I claimed. Rather, he just said it's possible that evolution produces these. And that doesn't contradict anything I said, and it actually just fits perfectly with what I said. So I guess we actually don't disagree here. And I think I've addressed all of the comments there. So I'll go forward.
Okay.
Are we going to play poker later? Because it sounds like you're setting yourself up.
It sounds like I'm playing with a cheater at poker.
Yeah, well, but the thing is, you've misrepresented what I was thinking of. If you get dealt even one royal flush, I'm going to be very doubtful that this is not a product of pure chance. I'm going to think you're biasing it something. Now, the thing is, with your other arguments, I am arguing that it is far more probable that things like consciousness and morality evolved by natural selection, by processes in the natural world, because those processes are described by evidence, things that we actually see. We actually have evidence of the evolution of morality in different organisms. We can see that, we can measure it. We have known phenomena, known mechanisms that can produce these phenomena. And you're saying, okay, but my God hypothesis is more probable. And I'm going to say, no, because you can't demonstrate any of that. You haven't told me what's in my back pocket yet. And you haven't demonstrated that there has been any kind of intervention by a deity to produce morality in human beings. This is the ground state of where I come from, is you can't make hypothetical arguments about mere probability without also having a great deal of knowledge about the probability of individual events. So we know how cards work, we know how poker works. That's the basis for saying, well, you got 10 royal flushes in a row. I can calculate the probability that it's pretty darn low and pretty darn unlikely. But as a theist, you're not constrained by that. You can just say, yeah, it's improbable, but hey, I've got God on my side. God wants me to win this poker game. And so he stacked the deck for me. Well, isn't that nice of it? But again, you haven't shown any evidence that this has occurred. It's pure chance that we're talking about. And we don't need to call this a fact in favor of either.
I think we have enough time for one more exchange between you two, so we'll go 5 minutes. We'll go 5 minutes each, so kind of rebuttal and closing remarks, and then we'll move to questions.
I mean, we can just continue this back and forth, right?
Sure.
Okay. So, I'm not sure I'm following. You're saying, like, because you haven't demonstrated the existence of God, you can't say that some fact is more likely given theism than atheism. Is that something what you're trying to say?
Yes, because you haven't demonstrated a single fact of God.
You mean you haven't demonstrated God, not a fact, because there's like conscious agency.
Oh, no, the facts I will accept exist, but your interpretation of the facts as the product of a divine being, I haven't seen any evidence of that.
So you don't think it's more likely that there would be conscious agency given theism because?
Well, to turn your own argument back on you, or whole A and whole B, et cetera, if you look at the world, you find that we're vastly outnumbered by unconscious agents. That the few conscious agents suggest that this is a rare event. And further, you're not going to find any conscious agents on the moon, or Mars, or the moons of Jupiter. So the universe seems to be pretty much devoid of conscious agents. If we're making a probabilistic argument here, we're the rare marble pulled out of the bowl.
So the thought is something like, if theism is true, conscious agency should be everywhere. I don't know if that's the case. I don't know why you think that either.
But you're arguing that if atheism is true, we wouldn't have conscious agents.
I'm arguing that it's less likely given atheism than theism.
I would argue that it seems to be pretty likely. That that's what the evidence of the natural world tells us, is that conscious agents pop into existence all the time under the kinds of pressures that evolution provides.
Right, but there didn't have to be evolution at all. There didn't have to be life at all. Additionally, the claim has to be that it's greater given atheism than theism. Right, that's what evidence is. It's more likely given the truth of a hypothesis than the truth of a competing hypothesis.
Except I think you're setting up a false dichotomy. You're making this probabilistic argument. And we're not interested in that kind of probabilistic argument. We're interested in what you can demonstrate, what can you show us about how the natural world operates. And you're just making this argument that this particular result, that when you get a royal flush in a game of poker, God therefore exists. And
I don't recall making the royal flush argument that God exists because of that.
Well, any really unlikely result is now going to be deployed in favor of theism.
So your issue is we can't test things in the future and like observe. But do you believe that Abraham Lincoln was, shot?
Yeah, we can test these things. We can evaluate.
Yeah, you can look at like documents. Show me under a microscope. Like you can't do an experiment. You can look at facts and see if they're more likely. We have lots of testimony that he was shot, and that's more likely given that he was shot than that he wasn't.
Abraham Lincoln was not put under a microscope, so that's But yeah, you're posing a very naive and simplistic view of how science works. That it's not all microscopes, it's not all telescopes. It's looking at the evidence and following it wherever it may go. And I consider historical evidence to be good scientific evidence, because historians are also using the tools that scientists use to assess the truth, the falsity of the observation.
So I mean, this likelihood principle just follows from Bayes' theorem. Do you reject math?
Oh, what a thing to say to a scientist. No, of course not.
So the point is, like you're saying we're taking these different approaches. I'm just giving you things that are more likely. Like we're working with the likelihood principle.
And I'm saying that the hypothesis he proposed is actually the least likely given the preponderance of the evidence. That when we can marshal 1,000,000 facts in support of the atheistic interpretation of events, and you can't even tell me what's in my back pocket, I think we can say that Bayes is going to favor the scientific perspective.
So you're, the back pocket argument. So I'm confused. Is your claim that it's more likely that I would know it's in your back pocket if theism is true than if atheism is true?
I'm arguing for a specific mechanism. Can you call on this divine being and ask him to give you privileged information and he can then relay it to you?
Should we expect that if theism is true? That's the key question. And you've given no reason.
I would agree that you can come up with 1,000 excuses for why it doesn't.
I'm not going to with excuses. I'm wondering, should we expect that? Because that's what you're claiming, and you have to actually justify that commitment.
I would say that you should expect that if you expect the God hypothesis to be useful at all. Maybe not my back pocket, okay? That's just an extreme example. But you ought to be able to communicate with this being and get information about significant things as well. And you can't.
If it's to be useful, but we're interested in what's true, not what's useful, right?
Okay, so we could just end the debate there by saying God is not useful. And Harry Hendricks says the term.
Philosophers aren't useful, they exist. If we're trying to figure out whether something is true, it's weird to figure out whether it's useful. Like, that's kind of odd, don't you think? And irrational.
I would say it's not just, is it useful, but does it have a measurable concrete effect? Can we determine anything from this particular being? And it seems like it's nothing. We can't get anything from it.
What matters for truth is what's probable, not what's measurable. We want to know what's probable, right?
I've already told you that science has a whole battery of conclusions that we've made about what is probable. And the evidence is all on our side, our largely atheistic, not exclusively side. And none of that evidence is backing up the conclusion.
I know that you've said that several times, but you haven't shown it. So when you say something, you got to give evidence that it's true. So we haven't been given any. You say that we have all this scientific evidence that shows theism is probably false. What are you talking about? Do you think evolution is evidence against theism? Why? If you think it is, you have to say it's unlikely if theism is true, or that it's more likely given atheism than theism. But you haven't done that, and you haven't done that with any of the other claims. So as it stands, you've just said it, you've not shown it.
If you want to come into the lab and we'll do some experiments together, and we'll actually see these results. That I mentioned chemistry is a great example, because chemistry can produce quantifiable, measurable results using mathematics. You can make predictions about where it's going to go. I can't make any similar predictions from any theistic principles. So that's why I say that theism doesn't provide any evidence.
Well, first, you just told me you could make a prediction from theism. It was something that we should be able to know what's in your back pocket, or we should know other things like that. So you do think theism makes predictions. And then second, it's not clear that anything going on in a chemistry lab is less likely given theism than atheism. So again, that's not going to be evidence against
Yes,
theism.
I'm willing to say that theism makes predictions. The problem is that they always fail.
So we've gone from theism does not make predictions to now theism makes predictions. There's progress.
Okay, and where does this progress end? Is it with you becoming an atheist?
No, it ends with you changing your mind about whether theism predicts something. You were saying it did, and now it didn't, and now you have a more coherent.
But I could, for instance, say that I'm going to predict that monkeys will fall from the ceiling and land on the stage. Is that a valid prediction? Does the simple fact that I talked about monkeys constitute a prediction?
You just said, I predict monkeys will fall from the stage. That's a prediction. It just didn't happen.
Exactly, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So what's the point of this? Making an arbitrary prediction on the basis of no prior knowledge and no empirical, physical, measured evidence. It's a kind of prediction in a very colloquial sense, but it's not a prediction in a material, measurable sense.
So, I mean, I can predict that, so the fact that a child's wearing a coat is some evidence that, and it's cold out, is some evidence that the child's parents are good, because it's more likely that the child's parents would dress appropriately, given that they're good parents than that they're bad parents.
Okay.
So why can't we do similar things with what I was saying? If theism is true, we'd expect God to create things that, facts that occupy the best kinds of worlds. And some of those facts are, conscious agency.
It's
higher level.
working backwards from everything. So it's like saying, it's a good thing for children to get presents on Christmas, and if Santa exists, he would probably show that good children receive presents, therefore Santa exists.
Yes.
This is your argument, is that we're going to make this kind of backwards prediction.
Yeah, I feel like I'm looking at Santa right now. But this is just Bayes' theorem. This is just math. It doesn't have to be a future prediction. We're just looking at what facts are more likely because of these in the nature.
So let's pause here. And now the question and answer portion will start. So if my mic runners could go and grab the mics, if we could bring the house lights up, get ready with your questions and raise your hands because everyone will be ask their speakers their own.
And if you don't ask nice questions, Santa's bringing in nothing.
Can everyone hear this?
No.
Nope. Testing, testing. Good? It works?
Is it on?
Yeah, it should be on. People are saying, oh,
Oh, no.
okay.
I have to know what is in your back pocket.
No, I've got something in my back pocket. I'll let a few more people make guesses, and then before we leave, I'll show you. You'll never predict it.
Oh. Pretty good audience.
This one's for Dr. Perry Hendricks. I believe earlier you stated that the God would be all moral, correct? Morally, I forgot how you defined it.
Perfectly good.
Perfectly good. So, in response to the argument of calling upon and asking for knowledge, would it be God's moral right or moral duty to respond to us?
Can you, so if we're asking for moral law, can you restate that? I'm not sure I'm following.
So would it be, if the deity is morally good and morally perfect, would it be morally bad or morally good for them to respond to us? That makes sense.
Like to respond to prayer or something like that?
Yes. So would they be obligated morally to respond?
I don't think they'd be obligated. Yeah, I don't think they'd be obligated.
Thank you.
And also, no need for the doctor. Only like pretentious professors demand to be called doctor.
And just let me add to that, that's basically your aversion of the problem of evil, which Harry talks about with skeptical atheism, or skeptical theism. And as my interpretation of the argument would be, you say that Well, we don't know how God's mind is working on this problem. Maybe God's got some mysterious reason why he's not giving all of the students here an answer. Do you agree with that? Am I misinterpreting it?
The question is, do I think it's possible there's a reason for God to refrain from answering prayers? Is that it?
I think we all agree that it's possible because he doesn't.
Yeah, what's possible is what's actual. Or what's actual is possible. So yeah, that's, yeah. Was that what you were asking? If that is, I agree.
Okay, and I guess a very that would be, do you think it's probable that
Oh, do I think it's probable that there's a reason that renders it permissible? So you're asking in the context of skeptical theism, which is this thing that we haven't, which is a very big topic.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to give a summary answer here, but I'll just go with no.
Okay. You could just say skeptical theism is a get out of jail free for believers.
I could, but that'd be false, so I don't want to
It sounds like it to me, but okay.
Well, we can talk about it later.
Yeah, let's get more questions.
Okay, my question is for Harry about your necessary foundation. So I'm just curious as to why you wouldn't consider matter a necessary element of the universe, and why that couldn't be applied to suggest any number of reliant principles. And I think PZ briefly touched on this with the law of thermodynamics, but I think laws of thermodynamics. But I think the fact that we cannot fathom a universe, or we cannot, throughout all our empirical observation of the universe, we've never been able to create or destroy matter. That seemingly suggests that matter is inherently, to some degree, necessary to our universe.
Right, so a couple things. I didn't claim that matter wasn't necessary. I just said there was something that existed that was necessary. As to your, and that's compatible, I'd say I guess we just don't know what it is, and it's still predicted on theism and not predicted on atheism. But to your other point, I mean, you're saying, like, imagine how long the universe has been here. 14 billion years, right? That's a long time. How long have humans been here? Not long at all. So in this teeny tiny sample, you've had a couple humans trying to create and destroy matter, as you say. Do you think that's a good inductive inference to it not being possible to be created or destroyed? And then secondly, the second point would be like, if you think it's, well, I'll leave it at that. Like, it doesn't seem like we have a great reason for thinking it's not possible that matter could have failed to exist.
My response to that would be, from an empirical perspective, we should use all available evidence. And so, given that all evidence that is available to us as humans who observe suggests that matter cannot be created or destroyed, and that suggests that matter is a necessary foundation, would that not, through your principle of probable induction, would that not suggest that, or would that not be as strong of possible evidence that could exist that matter is necessary?
Well, no, because again, humans, we're pretty impressive in lots of ways, but at this point, our inability to do something isn't terribly impressive. But, yeah, more to the point, I'm not, maybe I'll leave it at that. Like, I don't think that it's terribly impressive that humans aren't able to destroy it, and I'm not sure that we have a good reason other than that to think that matter is necessary. Maybe there is, but I'm not aware of one.
Hey, yeah, I got a question for Perry.
There's another person here, guys.
I know, but it's, I don't know, I feel like it's like kind of easier to point to like specific
parts of your argument and like criticize them. Why do you think that consciousness is good?
Well, one way to think about it is, like, what would you save? Like, a rock from being crushed, or like, you know, a conscious agent like a human?
But you
Well,
want
I mean, these are
evidence.
our-
You said everything had to have evidence. What's the evidence that consciousness is good?
Oh, the fact that we can look at, we are able to, like, see value. Like, some things are good,
That's
some things are bad.
That seems subjective.
You don't think there are things that are good and bad?
Yeah, because I subjectively think that they're good and bad.
Right, so like setting cats on fire or something isn't wrong if everyone believed it was okay. But yeah, I guess, I mean, one way to think about it, so there's a lot of different views about moral epistemology. How do we know what's good and what's evil? And one way is, popular way is called intuitionism. Like, we are able to sort of see that things are good and bad. And another way to do it is just test. What should we save? If we had to prevent something from being destroyed, should we save the rock or should we save the crow? Should we save the flower? Should we save the human? And so there's a few tests. Of course, so if you're an intuitionist about moral epistemology, it's like you can't prove these things, right? But if you hold these views about what's intuitively good and bad, you can have some justification for them on a pretty standard view of moral epistemology.
Okay, so then, sorry, this is an annoying question. It's kind of a three-parter. We just kind of
It's a three-parter?
Okay, so is it fair to say that like to make such an assessment like necessitates agency at all?
What do you mean?
Well, like you have to like choose. Oh, is the rock more important, or is like the human more important, or like we're making like this value judgment, but it seems like what's valuable and what's not basically like only matters if we are able to I don't know, I guess make decisions about what we value or something like that.
I don't understand why you think that.
Huh?
I mean, it makes sense because, like, if my choices aren't determined by me, then they're being determined by something else. So then that value doesn't come from me. You don't have any reason to say that, like, because Mutu chose to save the human over the rock, he's conferring some value on it. Therefore, consciousness has value. But if my choices aren't made by me, they're made by some psychological process, then it doesn't confer that same value.
Right, so yeah, the thought here is you're rationally deciding, but if you think that you aren't rationally deciding, well, you're in a lot more trouble than just with respect to value.
Yeah, which leads me to my last point, and thank you for saying what I want to say, but like way more eloquently. Yeah, so there's kind of like a growing body of like research and philosophers that say, oh, actually we don't have it. Determinism, right? So like, what do you think about theism under determinism? Like, if determinism is true, does that throw theism out the door? If not, why? And I guess I'm going to give away the mic now.
So the question is determinism, suppose we found out determinism is true, is that more likely given theism or atheism? Am I getting it right? Because the question is whether determinism poses a problem to theism. So the way that we should think about that is it more likely given atheism than theism?
Yeah, it just seems like, us not actually having agency like throws wrench in a lot of things.
What's the reason to think there's no agency if determinism is true?
Well, so there's people who are compatibilists think that determinism and free will are compatible, right? That's a perfectly respectable position. And so determinism doesn't necessarily do away with agency. Or even obviously, I guess. In fact, I imagine most compatibilists would want to say that's false.
We can have both proofs.
A question for PC.
Oh boy.
So I definitely agree with you that things like morality and high-level knowledge are totally compatible with evolution and don't really like suggest anything about a supreme being or whatever. It totally makes sense that we would evolve intelligence and morality. Makes total sense to me. But I feel like things like consciousness, and not just the consciousness of like we behave, like we can make decisions or whatever, but like the actual fact that it feels like something to be alive, that, and the fact that there is something rather than nothing, do seem kind of mysterious to me. And so I guess my question would be is, do you see that there are certain things like consciousness and just the fact that there is anything that are mysterious in a way that it seems like science really isn't even the process to answer?
So are you arguing that humans are special in the nature of our consciousness?
Well, it seems like it. It seems like you can't help but sincerely feel like there's something weird and like that you are aware of existence and whatnot. And it seems like science is within that awareness, but it doesn't seem like I can't imagine any scientific theory actually explaining anything about that.
Well, yeah, but then at the same time, I don't see anything unique to humans about that. And don't you keep cats?
I do actually.
Yeah, look at your cats. What do? They seem to have very deep, imponderable thoughts about things. We can't measure them, but they seem to be there. And you know, I work with spiders, and you're welcome to come over to the lab and I can show you spiders. And you'll see that they exhibit complex behaviors. Are they conscious behaviors? I think it's kind of unfair to say that no, they aren't. They seem to be responding to their environment in interesting ways, and they seem to be having these autonomous thoughts that motivate them to do various things. So, you know, I think it's a false distinction to suggest that that's it. Our awareness of the universe seems to be a consequence of how our brains work. And our brains are made of meat. It's how they work.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I have just one other question. It might be stupid, and I know that is kind of like a general question that people ask, but if there is this God who is all-knowing and all-good, I think we can argue that like the human race is very good, but also can be very bad at the same time. Why do you think a God would create something that would not only hurt themselves, but hurt others? In like the sense of like humans are one of the only like species that can torture. Like they're the only ones that like knowledgeably and like consciously hurt other people. Throughout history you see it and everything. That's the question.
Cats.
Or cats.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. So the question is, you know, if God exists, why are people so bad? Why are there like humans that exist that do bad things? Yeah. So this is like the problem. Well, this is the way to approach the question, right? This is what would have like if you want to think about whether theism is true. Here's a piece of evidence that there's some evil, and maybe we think that that's evidence against theism. So. I have a few responses here. One, like my official response, which is the skeptical theist one, which is probably a bit, I don't have the time to go into now, was going to say that that's not evidence. But here's another response. We might expect kinds of evil given theism because there are lots of second-order goods that require certain kinds of evil. Courage is a kind of good thing. It requires there to be suffering to face, to show courage in the face of. Character building, you can only build character if there are certain bad things you're experiencing. That's a good thing that you think requires evil. Arguably, if you think there's free will, you might think that having free will means that you're allowing the possibility of evil. Maybe you think that's a decent reason. Or, I mean, so there's quite a few second order goods that require this evil. So you might think that evil's not terribly unlikely given theism in light of that. But, if you don't think that, I still think that the four facts that I cited are much stronger evidence for theism than evil is evidence against it. So you might say evil is evidence against theism, but it's swamped by all this other evidence for theism, because you have to look at the total evidence, taking into account all the facts of the matter, not just one, when you're determining what's more probable. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
got time for maybe 2 more questions, so that one and then one more.
So to kind of build off of what she said earlier, you believe, I missed the first half of this debate, so I don't know your exact opinion on this, but would you say that, but you said your God, or your interpretation of God is all good, right?
So God is, the hypothesis under consideration is that an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being exists, so yeah.
Okay, so why would a perfectly good being allow like such like bad things to happen to objectively good people? So like, I know it's a simple question, but like.
Yeah, so again, I have 3 kinds of response to this. One is the skeptical theist response, which I can't really get into here. Maybe I'll say this, like, skeptical theists say, look, our cognitive limitations are pretty severe with respect to evaluating goods and evils and things like that. And because of that, our inability, our lack of recognition of some God-justifying reason for allowing evil isn't unexpected. It's not unlikely, or something like that. But secondly, you might think that there are lots of second-order goods that require there to be evils that that make it not unlikely that God would allow evil. Things like courage, things like character building, things like building connections between people, things of that nature. And third, even if we think that that is evidence, what we need to do is take into account our total evidence. You can't just focus on evil, and just like you can't just focus on the facts I listed, you have to look at the total amount of evidence and take that into account. And so even if you think evil is some evidence against theism, you might also think it's swamped by the other evidence that we have for theism.
I would argue though that the total evidence says that the universe is indifferent to what we care about.
I would say that if there was a God, I would see him as he created the universe and then he dipped out. Because I don't see a just God allowing like children to be tortured for literally no reason besides like personal entertainment. I would say there is no beneficial value to like anyone for that. So I don't know.
Right, so again, you need to look at the total evidence. If you're just focusing on one thing, if you want to be rational when evaluating this, you need to take into account the whole array of evidence. He says it makes it likely that the universe is indifferent, the total evidence, but we've not really been given any evidence to that either.
The universe doesn't seem to care about whether you squish a crow or a rock.
Well, the universe isn't sentient, so it's not going to care about anything.
But you're saying that, so you're arguing that your deity is something independent of the universe? That's somehow taking actions on our world?
I certainly wouldn't say the universe is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good.
I would say that that's the universe is the best example we've got.
Of what?
Of a powerful and all-knowing, in a sense, sort of existence.
It's not sentient.
It
doesn't
doesn't
know
know,
anything.
but you haven't shown me that your God is sentient.
But hold on, whoa. You think the universe knows things?
No, I do not.
You just said it.
I think the universe doesn't care. That
Of
there's
course-
nothing.
Of course it doesn't care. It's an inanimate object. It's not conscious.
Exactly. That's all we need.
But how is this evidentially relevant? Do you think that theism doesn't, a universe, do you think theism predicts a sentient universe?
The theism, well, it's pretty vague about what you mean by God. But first of all, yeah, maybe. You tell me. I'm not the theist up here.
Right, but if you want to say it's evidence against theism, you have to say it's more likely given atheism than theism.
I'm
That's what
saying
evidence
that the overwhelming evidence says that the universe is indifferent and uncaring, and maybe it's a product of your God, but I would say that it reflects the nature of your God.
I mean, I agree the universe is uncaring because it's not a sentient thing. I don't know what you mean other than that.
You've got no other evidence for how the thing that God works than his works, and the things that your God created are indifferent and uncaring.
Well, there are lots of good facts. There are lots of facts that I think are more likely given theism than atheism. I don't understand. I'm not sure I'm understanding what your complaint is here. But you just keep talking about the universe not caring, and I agree because it's not a thing.
But you're also going to argue that this universe is a product of your God.
Yeah.
Why does God make something so horribly casual about death and life and all these things?
Okay, so you're just running a problem of evil. Okay, now I understand.
more than promise. A problem of, I don't care, sort of attitude of part of the universe.
Let's go to one final question. Okay, go got it.
This is for both of you. For the purposes of this debate, we have defined God as all good. How do you define all good, and how do you apply that definition to your God?
I imagine it was said that was for both of us, but it sounds like it was just for me. How would you apply that to your God, Phoebe?
I would, there is no God, so.
Right, so if something's all good if it does no moral wrong and does the best action when the best action is available, or if there's an infinite series of actions so that one could do but no best action, it would pick something that's sufficiently good along that list. So just something that doesn't do anything morally wrong, always does what's morally required, and always does good things when there are multiple good options. And then how does that apply to God? Well, that's just a definition of what perfect goodness is. Am I missing what that was after?
It's more of like, can you give us concrete examples of what you define as all good? Because like, for this whole thing, it was like, God is all good. And so I'm just like, what does that mean? You know what I mean?
So, think about it this way, like, setting cats on fire wrong? Like, that's a bad thing, right? A being wouldn't be perfectly good if it set a cat on fire. So, any being that does that isn't perfectly good.
That's negative.
What?
What's the positive of it? What is the good?
Oh, what is a good thing?
Yeah.
Oh, like health, well-being, having good relationships with people. You live life. Don't you know good things? Is it just pure misery, or like have you found something like eat some food, talk to some people? Like, do you not know the good there is?
But I guess those are human things, Harry. What's good in the context of this universal being? Good things are good. What do you mean?
But what is good?
Yeah. I can give you examples of good.
Go ahead.
Health, well-being. Wait, I'm confused. Am I missing the question? Those are examples of good things.
So good things are things you like, and bad things are things you don't like.
No, because like let's suppose that you like setting cats on fire. That still wouldn't be a good thing.
I think she's asking you to respond to moral relativism.
So are you saying that because most people consider X, Y, Z to be a good thing?
Oh no. It's not just because somebody thinks it, but I'm giving examples of things that I think you personally can recognize as good. Don't you know these things are good? Like just in the same way that you know other things, like there can't be true contradictions. Like these are things that you're able to recognize.
But there's also so much bad in the world. Like it's disgusting out here.
Yeah, so then we have a kind of problem of evil, right? Like why does God allow bad things? Yeah, right. So first off, nobody should be setting cats on fire, just as an advisor. Secondly, this is another version of the problem of why are there bad things, or even the possibility of bad things. And there's a few, I'm going to go through my list again. I think that the skeptical theist response is probably the right one. But also there are lots of second order goods that require kinds of evil, like courage and character building. And lastly, once again, I'm like a record on repeat, but you need to look at the total evidence. If you're just looking at one piece, you might think that evil is some evidence against theism, but you might also think that the other evidence for it swamps it.
Okay, but if you're looking at the total evidence, sorry, I stole the mic from her. If you're looking at the total evidence, so you have four concrete, what you see as concrete things, and you continue weighing singular things against those four seemingly to you concrete things. What if this one thing is so much bigger than those four things? Like, we keep on bringing up evil, because it is constantly around. It is much more seen than the four things that you've listed. Those are tiny little aspects of who we are as individual human beings. But all of the world has this chaos and evil going around. So how do you pick those four things over this huge one thing?
That's a good question. So first off, these aren't four tiny aspects of who you are. You aren't here if you're not a conscious agent, right? Then that is what you are. But secondly, you're right, evil could be this really, really strong evidence that swamps the ones I talk about. The problem is that I just don't think there's a good reason to think evil is strong evidence. I don't think there's a good reason to think evil is evidence, let alone strong evidence. So you might think that,
No,
but we need...
you just gave the example of setting cats on fire as evil.
So we do agree we can identify evil and good things, right? That's what's at work here.
But the vast majority of cats are going to die miserable, painful deaths from disease, parasites, starvation, accidents. They're going to go out in horrible ways that are just as horrible as setting them on fire. So where does God fit into this equation?
Once again, this is just another version of the problem of evil. The question is, why should we think that that's terribly unexpected?
This is a version of the probability argument we've been making all night.
Yeah.
That the majority, the great vast majority of cats are dying horrible deaths. And you want to say, well, there's this possibility that somebody might set cats on fire. So that's a pretty unlikely thing.
Well, I don't want to say that. I want to say, the probability of, so we need to ask, what's the probability we'd expect a world to consisting of cats dying in these ways, given theism versus given atheism? And it doesn't seem to me that it's so I want to say we don't know the probability. I want to say it's inscrutable. And once we say it's inscrutable, it can't be evidence, because for the likelihood principle to work, you got to be able to describe the probability of each one. So that's what I think is actually at work here, but that's also a complex topic. So if you want a shorter answer, I would just say I don't think it's strong evidence.
So this all-knowing, all-good God is sitting back and watching this evil take place, yet he created us, and he's just watching his guinea pigs eat each other alive, and doing nothing to help them, nothing to teach them. He's just sitting back and...
He's doing it in a benevolent and kindly way.
Right. Yeah, so again, if you want this to be evidence, you need to frame it in the way that it's more likely given atheism than theism. And I just don't think there's any reason to think that.
Why not? The fact that all these cats are dying in horrible ways, like Susie said, seems to me more evidence that this all-good God does not exist. It's more likely given that an all-good God does not exist because it's a bad thing that's happening.
Because atheists love killing cats.
He said it himself. Right, so because I think the probability is inscrutable, I don't think we can predict that.
Which is what I
wrote a book on
earlier.
this.
You can't know.
But yeah, it's a long argument. But yeah, I don't think the probability is. I think the probability is inscrutable.
Alrighty, well, as usually goes in philosophy, we have no answer for you. I think we can call it tonight. Everyone give a big round of applause. And before we go, one final gimmick tonight from the Philosophy Club. If you thought that PZ made a better argument tonight, please exit out that door corresponding to him. And if you thought that Perry made a better argument tonight, please exit out that door corresponding to Perry. Thank you very much for coming, everybody.
We don't get to leave if we didn't pick one?
What was that? Yeah. It's a little seal that says that he's a Kentucky colonel.
If it's inscrutable, then how can you use